These seats are taken, little girls. Run along back to economy where you belong. The words hit like a slap across the face. Richard Thompson didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. He just waved his hand, the way you wave away a fly, at two 11-year-old black girls standing in the aisle of first class, their boarding passes in hand, their luggage already overhead. His wife, Susan, laughed softly beside him, adjusting her pearl necklace unbothered, as if two children being dismissed from their rightful seats was the most natural thing in the world. That moment, that single arrogant wave of a hand, was about to cost Richard Thompson everything he had ever built. If this story made your blood boil, you are not alone. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. One morning started the way most important mornings do. Quietly, without warning, without any sense of what was coming. Jasmine Wilson woke up early without an alarm. That was just how she was built. Her twin sister, Kayla, was still buried under the covers, one arm hanging off the edge of the bed, her braids fanned out across the pillow like she hadn't moved a single inch since midnight. Jasmine sat up, looked at her sister for a long moment, and then did what she always did. She reached over and pulled the blanket clean off the bed. Kayla screamed like she'd been shot. Jasmine, it is way too early in the morning. It's time to get up, Jasmine corrected, already on her feet, already pulling her travel outfit from the back of the chair where she'd laid it the night before. And our flight is leaving soon. Dad said we needed to leave soon enough to make it on time. Kayla sat up slowly, her eyes barely open, her voice a low grumble. Dad also said we could sleep a little longer. Dad is not the one who takes forever to do her edges. There was a pause. Then Kayla was out of bed. That was the thing about Jasmine and Kayla Wilson. They were identical in almost every physical way. Same deep brown skin. Same wide, dark eyes. Same sharp cheekbones that their mother always said came straight from her side of the family. But the moment either of them opened her mouth, you knew exactly which one you were talking to. Jasmine led, Kayla observed. Jasmine charged forward. Kayla took notes. Together they had a way of moving through the world that people twice their age couldn't quite explain, like they had already figured something out that most adults were still working on. Their father, David Wilson, had raised them that way deliberately. David was not a man who arrived anywhere unannounced. When people heard his name, they straightened up. When his company, Wilson Technologies, filed a quarterly report, financial analysts cleared their schedules. He had built his empire from a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta with a second-hand laptop and a vision so clear and so relentless that it had turned into something that now employed over 14,000 people across 6 countries. He was the kind of black man whose presence in a room changed the temperature of it, and he had spent the last 11 years raising 2 daughters who knew in their bones, not just in their heads, that they deserved to take up space anywhere they chose to stand. He was not flying with them today. That was the part that mattered. David had a board meeting in New York that he could not reschedule, and Jasmine and Kayla were traveling alone to Atlanta for their grandmother's birthday. A woman who had told David in no uncertain terms that if those girls were not at her party, she would fly to New York herself and drag him there personally. So David had done what any reasonable man in his position would do. He had booked his daughters the best seats on the plane, packed their bags with everything they needed, gone over the emergency contacts 3 times, and handed Jasmine a card that simply read, "If anyone gives you trouble, call me first and argue second." Jasmine had read the card twice, folded it neatly, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket where she kept things that mattered. The drive to the airport was easy. Their driver, Andre, dropped them at departures, and the two girls moved through check-in with the calm efficiency of people who had been flying since they were old enough to walk. They knew which line to join. They knew how to handle their own luggage. They knew that the trick to getting through security quickly was to have your shoes off before you reach the bin and your laptop out before you reach the conveyor. Kayla bought a chocolate croissant at the terminal bakery. Jasmine bought a water bottle and a pack of gum and spent some time standing at the window watching planes taxi on the runway while Kayla ate in peaceful silence beside her. "You nervous?" Kayla asked between bites. "About what? Flying alone? No dad?" Jasmine considered this. "No," she said finally. "Are you?" Kayla thought about it with the same seriousness. "A little, but mostly I'm thinking about Grandma's cake. You think she's doing the lemon one again?" "She always does the lemon one." "Good." The gate was half full when they arrived, and boarding was already underway for first class. Jasmine pulled both their boarding passes up on her phone. Her father had insisted on digital, said it was faster, and the two girls joined the line without any fuss. The gate agent smiled at them, scanned both passes, and waved them through with a cheerful, "Have a great flight, ladies." They walked down the jetway side by side, Jasmine in the lead, Kayla one step behind and to the right, the way they always moved when they were going somewhere that required focus. The plane was a wide-body aircraft, clean and new-smelling, the kind of first class that had actual dividers between seats and enough legroom to stretch out completely. They found their row quickly, seats by the window and aisle left side of the cabin. There were two people in them. Jasmine stopped. She looked at the seats. She looked at her phone. She looked at the seats again. The man in the window seat was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a pressed blue blazer, and the particular expression of someone who had never once in his life been told no, and fully expected that record to continue. His hair was silver at the temples. His watch caught the light from the overhead panel. The woman beside him, in Kayla's seat, was similarly dressed for comfort and consequence. Her blonde hair pulled back, a glass of champagne already in her hand, even though the plane hadn't pushed back from the gate. Jasmine took a breath. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear and even. "I think you're in our seats." The man, Richard Thompson, though Jasmine did not know his name yet, did not look up immediately. He finished whatever he was reading on his phone, thumbed down the screen one more time, and then turned his head toward her with the slow, deliberate patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone small. "These seats are taken, little girls," he said. "Run along back to economy where you belong." And then he waved his hand. That wave, that single, casual, dismissive wave, like she was a gnat, like she was noise, like she was nothing. Jasmine felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but was something older and more complicated than either. She had felt it before. She knew what it was. And she had been raised by a father who taught her exactly what to do with it. She did not move. "Sir," she said, and her voice had not changed at all, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. "I have a boarding pass for this seat. My sister has a boarding pass for the one beside it. Those are our seats." Richard Thompson finally put his phone down. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and something passed across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite a frown. It was the look of a man recalibrating, reassessing, deciding how much this interruption was worth his time. "There must be some kind of mix-up," he said, with the tone of someone being very generous by engaging at all. "We were assigned these seats. Maybe yours are further back. Economy is very comfortable on this aircraft, I'm sure." "We're not in economy," Jasmine said. Jasmine, Kayla said softly from behind her. We are in first class, Jasmine continued, her voice still level, still clear. I can show you our boarding passes. She held up her phone. Richard Thompson looked at it the way someone looks at a parking ticket they fully intend to contest. His wife, Susan, leaned slightly forward to glance at the screen, then leaned back and said nothing. Her champagne caught the light. I'm sure it's just a system error, Richard said. These things happen. Why don't you find a flight attendant and they'll sort you out with alternate seats? These are our seats, Jasmine repeated. Young lady, these are our seats. The cabin had gone very quiet. Jasmine could feel it. The awareness creeping through the surrounding rows, the way people in nearby seats had stopped looking at their phones and were now looking at this. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman behind them shifted in her seat. The quiet had a texture to it, thick and attentive and waiting. Kayla stepped forward until she was standing beside her sister. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, because that was who Kayla was. That was how they worked. And the two of them together in that aisle made a statement that didn't need words. Richard Thompson looked at them both, and something shifted in his expression. Not into kindness, into a different kind of authority. The kind that reaches for backup. Excuse me, he said, raising his hand toward the front of the cabin. Excuse me, could I get a flight attendant, please? The flight attendant who appeared was named Jessica. Jasmine would remember that name for a very long time. Jessica was in her 30s, efficient-looking, with a practiced calm of someone who had managed 1,000 small dramas at 35,000 feet. She came down the aisle with a professional smile already in place, assessed the situation in a single glance, and then did something that would define the next several hours of her life. She looked at Richard Thompson first. Is there a problem, sir? These young ladies seem to be confused about their seats, Richard said. They're claiming these two, but we were assigned them. I think there may have been a computer error. Jessica turned to Jasmine and Kayla with an expression that was careful but already tilted, the kind of careful that leans in one direction. Before the conversation starts. Can I see your boarding passes, girls? Jasmine handed over her phone without a word. Jessica studied the screen. Something flickered across her face very briefly, an expression Jasmine couldn't quite read, and then it was smoothed over again. These passes do show the correct seats, Jessica said slowly, but I want to check with the gate to make sure there wasn't a duplicate assignment. Sometimes the system... There's no duplicate, Jasmine said. Our father booked these seats weeks ago in first class on this flight for us. I understand that, sweetheart, but please don't call me sweetheart. Jessica blinked. The word had landed cleanly, not rudely, but with a precision that left no room for debate. Jasmine was not rude. She was never rude, but she was exact. And exactness in an 11-year-old had a quality that made adults uncomfortable in ways they couldn't immediately name. My apologies, Jessica said, and the apology was genuine enough that Kayla quietly noted it. I just want to make sure we have the right information. Could I ask, are your parents on this flight? Our father is in New York for a board meeting, Jasmine said. Our mother passed away 2 years ago. We are traveling alone with his full knowledge and permission to our grandmother's birthday party in Atlanta. Our emergency contact is our father, David Wilson. And these are our seats. The name, David Wilson, landed somewhere in the air between them. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something happened behind her eyes. A small internal motion, like a card being turned over and examined, and then set face down again on the table. Richard Thompson, who had been listening to this entire exchange with the mildly satisfied air of someone watching a bureaucratic inconvenience being handled, now spoke again. Look, he said. "I think the simplest solution here is for the airline to upgrade these girls' seats. Or their existing seats are probably just fine, and this is all a misunderstanding. We have a flight to catch. Can we sort this out?" "We are sorting it out," Jasmine said, and she turned back to Jessica. "I would like to speak to your supervisor, please." Jessica's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just for a moment. "I'm sure that's not necessary." "It clearly is," Jasmine said, "because you haven't asked the gentleman occupying my seat to show you his boarding pass. You've asked me to justify my presence here. So, yes, I would like to speak to your supervisor." The cabin had gone even quieter than before. Somewhere in the rows behind them, someone coughed. Someone else shifted their weight. A man in the row across had his phone out under his tray table, angled slightly upward. He was recording. Jessica did not call her supervisor immediately. She asked Jasmine and Kayla politely, professionally, firmly, if they would mind waiting in the boarding area while she verified the seat assignments. Jasmine said she did not mind if Jessica would also ask the gentleman in the window seat to step out while the verification occurred. Jessica said that wouldn't be necessary. Jasmine said, "Then I'll wait here." It was Kayla who finally spoke, and when she did, her voice was so quiet and so measured that it carried in the silence the way a pin drop carries in an empty room. "If those were two adult white passengers standing here," Kayla said, "would you be asking them to wait in the boarding area?" Nobody answered. Nobody had to. The question answered itself. Richard Thompson, for the first time, looked slightly uncomfortable. His wife, Susan, had stopped sipping her champagne. Jessica was holding Jasmine's phone like it had become something heavier than it was when she first took it. The silence stretched, and then it broke because Jasmine's phone buzzed in Jessica's hand. Jessica looked down at the screen automatically, the way anyone does when a phone buzzes. She saw the name on the incoming call. She saw it, and then she looked up at Jasmine. And in that single moment, something changed. Not everything, not yet, but something in the exact tilt of her expression. She handed the phone back. On the screen in bold letters was the name. Dad. David Wilson. Jasmine looked at it. She looked at Jessica. She looked at Richard Thompson, who was looking at the screen too, though from far enough away that he couldn't read it clearly. She answered the phone. "Hi, Dad." David Wilson's voice came through clearly, warm and unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that the best way to assert power was to never sound like you were asserting anything at all. "Hey, baby, you boarded okay? I just saw the flight status update." "We're on the plane," Jasmine said. "We're having a situation." A beat. Just one beat. "Tell me." Jasmine did not look at Richard Thompson while she spoke. She looked straight ahead at the galley wall at the front of the cabin, her voice steady and factual, laying out the situation with the precision of someone who had been coached her whole life to lead with facts and follow with feelings. She told him about the seats, about the wave of the hand, about Jessica asking them to wait while the man who had taken their seats was permitted to stay, about the question Kayla had asked that no one had answered. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line. It was a very particular kind of silence, the kind that precedes a decision already being made. "Put the flight attendant on the phone," David said. Jasmine turned to Jessica, who had been listening to the entire summary with an expression that had moved through several phases: professional concern, private doubt, something that might have been guilt, and held the phone out. "My father would like to speak with you." Jessica took the phone. She said, "Hello," with the voice of someone who already suspected this call was not going to go the way most calls go. She listened. In those seconds, her posture changed. Her shoulders changed. The hand that wasn't holding the phone came up and touched the side of her neck, briefly, and then dropped. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand, sir." A pause. "No, sir, Yes, I hear you." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course. Yes, right away." She lowered the phone. She looked at Richard Thompson. She looked at Susan Thompson. She looked at Jasmine and Kayla Wilson, standing in the aisle of first class with their boarding passes and their matching travel outfits and 11 years of being raised to know their worth. And then, for the first time since this conversation had started, the balance shifted. "Mr. Thompson," Jessica said, her voice careful, her face carefully composed. "I'm going to need to ask you and your wife to come with me." Richard Thompson stared at her. "I beg your pardon? These girls' seats have been confirmed. Your booking shows a different row. There appears to have been an error in how you were directed to these seats at boarding. If you'll come with me, we'll get you sorted out." Richard Thompson did not move. For several full seconds, he did not move. His face went through something: surprise, confusion, indignation, and then finally, that particular shade of red that belongs to powerful men who have never been redirected in their lives. "We are not moving," he said. "We were told these were our seats. Sir, we have been seated. We have our drinks, and I am not going to be moved because some—" He stopped himself, just barely stopped himself. But Jasmine heard it. Kayla heard it. Jessica heard it. The man across the aisle, with his phone angled upward, heard it. Everyone heard what Richard Thompson almost said. And in that almost, in that half second of almost, Richard Thompson's story changed forever. Because now it wasn't about seats anymore. Jasmine held her father's phone against her ear. "Dad," she said quietly, "he just almost said something." "I heard," David said, and his voice had changed. The warmth was still there underneath, the way a floor is still there underneath a rug. But what was on top now was something else entirely. Something flat and focused and absolute. "Jasmine, listen to me. Don't argue anymore. Just stand there. I'm making a call." "Okay," she said. "You are not moving from that aisle." "I know, Dad." "I love you. I love you too." She lowered the phone and stood in the aisle of that row in first class. And she did not move. And Kayla stood beside her. And neither of them said a word. And the whole cabin waited. And somewhere in the charged and breathless silence of that aircraft, the first domino had already fallen. Richard Thompson just didn't know it yet. He would. Very soon, he would know it. David Wilson's voice on that phone had been quiet. That was the part Jessica couldn't shake as she stood in the galley between the first-class cabin and the cockpit door. Her back to the passengers. Her hand pressed flat against the wall like she needed something solid to hold on to. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened. He had simply told her in a voice as level and certain as a man reading numbers off a ledger. Exactly who he was, exactly what he owned, and exactly what was going to happen if those two girls were not seated in their correct seats. Before this plane moved an inch. She'd worked for Meridian Airlines for years. She had handled drunken passengers, medical emergencies, a man who tried to open the exit door over the Pacific. She had never once felt her hands go cold the way they went cold during that phone call. Her supervisor, Gary Mitchell, was standing beside her now, his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between annoyed and alarmed, because Jessica had pulled him from the boarding door with an urgency that was not like her at all. "He said he's a major shareholder of Meridian," Jessica said. keeping her voice low. Wilson Technologies, David Wilson? Gary looked at her and didn't say anything because the look said it all. Gary Mitchell pulled out his own phone. In the cabin, exactly a short distance away, Richard Thompson was not a man accustomed to waiting. He had reclined slightly in the window seat, Jasmine's seat, the seat his hand had claimed and his arrogance had defended. And he was doing the thing that men like Richard Thompson always do when they sense a situation is not resolving in their favor. He was escalating the framing. He was turning to the passengers around him, to the couple nearby, to the older gentleman across the aisle, as if building a silent jury. "Can you believe this?" he said, low enough to be confidential, loud enough to be heard. 2 children holding up an entire flight over a seating mix-up. There are dozens of people on this plane. The man across the aisle said nothing. He looked at his magazine. The couple kept their eyes forward. Jasmine, standing a short distance from Richard Thompson with Kayla beside her, heard every word. She did not respond. She had her father's instructions in her head, like a compass setting. Don't argue anymore. Just stand there. And she stood there, still, upright, her hands loose at her sides, her face carrying an expression that was so controlled it was its own kind of statement. Kayla beside her was doing the thing she always did when Jasmine was holding the line. She was watching, taking inventory. The man whose phone had been angled low since this started. The woman who kept looking up and then quickly down. The older black couple in the row behind who had not looked away at all. Who were watching Jasmine and Kayla with an expression that was recognition and sorrow and something fiercer than either. "Jasmine," Kayla murmured, barely moving her lips. "I see him," Jasmine said. She meant the man with his phone. "He's been recording since the boarding pass thing." Jasmine said nothing, but something settled in her expression. Something that looked very briefly like her father. The flight was scheduled to push back soon. Gary Mitchell came back through the galley curtain. Jessica was 1 step behind him. Gary was a tall man, competent looking, the kind of face that inspired institutional confidence. And he was currently wearing an expression that Jessica had never seen on him in years of working the same routes. He looked like a man who had just learned something very expensive. He stopped at the row. He looked at Richard Thompson. He looked at Jasmine and Kayla. He looked at the boarding passes Jessica had pulled up on her tablet. Both confirmed. David Wilson's account, premium first-class booking, paid in full weeks prior. "Mr. Thompson," Gary said. Richard looked up. Finally, someone with some authority. "Could you please escort these girls to their correct seats so we can—" "Your booking," Gary said, "shows a different row." The cabin went so quiet that the ventilation system was suddenly audible. Richard Thompson's expression did not change at first. It held its position the way a wall holds its position right before it cracks. "I'm sorry." "A different row, sir. Your travel agent appears to have—" "There may have been a miscommunication at check-in. You were directed to the wrong seats. We were told these were our seats by the gate agent. And we apologize for that confusion. But these seats belong to these 2 young ladies. And I need to ask you and your wife to move to your confirmed seats right now." Susan Thompson set down her champagne glass. It made a small, precise sound in the silence. Richard Thompson stood up. He was a big man. Jasmine had not fully noticed how big until he was standing, taking up the space of the aisle, looking down at Gary Mitchell with the full weight of a man who had spent his entire adult life being deferred to and did not know how to process the alternative. "I am not moving," Richard said. "I am a Meridian Platinum Elite member. I have flown hundreds of thousands of miles on this airline. I have been in this seat for some time, I am not moving because of a booking error that your staff made. And I am certainly not moving because 2 children, Mr. Thompson. Gary's voice had found an edge. I need you to lower your voice. Don't tell me to lower my voice on an aircraft I have partially funded with my loyalty for years. Sir, do you know what I do? Do you have any idea who I know exactly who you are, Mr. Thompson, Gary said. And something in his delivery, a kind of flat, final certainty, stopped Richard mid-sentence. And I also know that this conversation is being recorded by at least 2 passengers in this cabin. And I'm asking you one final time to take your confirmed seats. A beat. Then Richard Thompson laughed. It was short and hard. And it had no humor in it at all. Fine, he said. Fine. This is absolutely outrageous, and I will be filing a formal complaint the moment we land, but fine. He looked at Jasmine as he stepped into the aisle. He looked at her the way people look at things they intend to finish dealing with later. Jasmine looked back at him with steady, dark eyes and did not drop her gaze for a single second. He moved past her. Susan gathered her things with the stiff dignity of someone performing composure in public. She did not look at the girls at all. Jasmine stepped into the row. She took the window seat. Kayla took the aisle. They put on their seatbelts. Jasmine looked out the window at the tarmac and exhaled once, slowly through her nose. You okay? Kayla asked quietly. Yeah, Jasmine said. Your hands are shaking. Jasmine looked down. They were. Slightly. She flattened them on her knees. Don't tell Dad that. Kayla almost smiled. He already knows. He knows everything. The thing about David Wilson that most people underestimated was this. He did not react. He responded. There was a difference, and that difference was the whole of who he was. While Jessica and Gary were managing Richard Thompson, David was already on his second phone call. Not the one to Jessica. That was done. His second call to a man named Arthur Hayes, who was Meridian Airlines Senior Vice President of Operations, and who happened to owe David Wilson 2 significant professional favors dating back years to a partnership negotiation that had gone in Arthur's favor primarily because David had chosen not to make it go the other way. The call lasted a few minutes. Arthur Hayes called Gary Mitchell directly. Jasmine and Kayla did not know about this call. They were seated, belted in. Kayla looking at the cloud shapes forming outside the window. Jasmine rereading the emergency card in the seat pocket with the focused concentration of someone who needed somewhere neutral to put her eyes while her heartbeat came back down. What they heard a few rows back was Richard Thompson's voice again. You are not serious. Gary's voice, lower, harder to catch. Then, Susan Thompson. This is a lawsuit. Do you understand that? This is a lawsuit. Then silence. Then the sound of bags being moved overhead. Then footsteps. Then the galley curtain moving. Kayla turned around. Jasmine did not. But she watched Kayla's face, which was the next best thing. They're gone, Kayla said. Both of them. They took them off the plane. Jasmine absorbed this. Off the plane? Gate agent met them at the door. They're getting off. Jasmine turned around then. The row was empty. The Thompsons' bags were gone. Richard Thompson was gone. Susan Thompson and her champagne glass and her pearl necklace and years of watching her husband treat people like furniture. All of it gone. The man across the aisle lowered his phone for the first time since boarding. He looked across the aisle at Jasmine, and then he did something unexpected. He nodded. Just once, small and serious, the way you nod at someone who just did something that needed doing. Jasmine nodded back. The thing that happened next was not something anyone on that flight anticipated. The plane did not push back right away. By the time it finally did, the captain had come on the intercom with the information that they were experiencing a brief operational delay and that passengers should remain seated. The economy cabin had started the low murmur of people exchanging theories. 3 people in business class were on their phones. A child somewhere toward the back started crying and then stopped. Jessica appeared at Jasmine's row. She crouched down, bringing herself to eye level, which Jasmine noted immediately as a different posture than the one she'd carried earlier. Earlier, she had stood over them. Now she was level. That shift cost something, and Jasmine respected it. "I owe you both an apology," Jessica said. Jasmine waited. "I should have asked to see his boarding pass first. I didn't handle that correctly, and I'm sorry." Kayla, who was better at receiving apologies than Jasmine, said, "Thank you for saying that." Jasmine said, "Why didn't you?" Jessica blinked. "Excuse me? Why didn't you ask him first?" "He was the one in the wrong seats. Why did you ask us?" Jessica opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. And here was the thing about Jessica, and this was what made her different from Richard Thompson, what kept her from being the villain of this story. Even though she had played a role in it, she didn't reach for an excuse. She sat with the question for a moment. Then she said, "I don't have a good answer for that. I think I made an assumption, and it was wrong." Jasmine looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay. Just okay. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but received." Jessica stood and went back to the galley, and Jasmine looked out of the window again at the tarmac, at the luggage carts moving, and the ground crew in their yellow vests. And she thought about her father's voice on the phone, about the way it had sounded when it changed, about the distance between warm and cold, and how fast a voice could travel that distance when the situation demanded it. Her phone buzzed, a text from David. "Still on the ground. I know. Stay seated. I'm handling the other part now." Jasmine stared at the words "other part" for several seconds. She typed back, "What other part?" 3 dots appeared. Then the recording, baby. Someone got the whole thing on video. It's already moving. Jasmine put the phone face down on her knee. She looked at Kayla. "Kel, I saw," Kayla said. She had been reading over Jasmine's shoulder. "Dad moves fast. He always moves fast. Are you scared?" Jasmine thought about Richard Thompson's hand closing around their boarding passes. The slow, deliberate crumple, the way he had looked at her when he did it. Not with anger, not even with contempt exactly, but with the comfortable, habitual ease of a man who had never once had to consider that she had the same right to be somewhere that he did. That was what had gotten under her skin, not the anger, the ease. "No," Jasmine said. "I'm not scared." "Good," Kayla said. She turned back to the window. "Because I think Dad just started a fire." She wasn't wrong. The video had been uploaded shortly after the Thompsons were removed from the plane by a man named Thomas Ellis, the passenger across the aisle, who had not planned on recording anything that morning. He had planned on sleeping through the flight to Atlanta. But there are moments in life where you look up from where you are and see something happening that is too important to look away from. And this had been one of those moments for Thomas Ellis. And so he had done the thing that ordinary people with phones do when they witness the extraordinary. He had pressed record. The video was 43 seconds long. It captured Richard Thompson's hand closing around the boarding passes. It captured the slow crumple. It captured the drop. It captured his voice saying they were in the wrong seats and get out of my sight. It captured Jasmine's face. Still, controlled, devastatingly calm for an 11-year-old. And it captured Kayla stepping forward to stand beside her sister without a word. The way soldiers step up, the way family steps up. By the time the plane finally pushed back from the gate, the video had tens of thousands of views. By the time the wheels lifted off the runway, it had hundreds of thousands. In Atlanta, David Wilson's communications director, a sharp young woman named Amanda Lopez, was already fielding calls from 3 media outlets. She had not called David yet to ask him what to do, because she had worked for him long enough to know, or that she was not the first call he had made that morning, and that whatever was already in motion was already further down the road than the press calls on her desk. She sent him a text instead. Media aware, waiting for your guidance on statement. He responded quickly. Nothing yet. Let it breathe. Let it breathe. That was David. He understood something that most people in his position never fully learned, which was that power applied too early closes doors, and power applied at the right moment opens rooms that didn't exist before. Richard Thompson landed in a different city on a different airline, having been rebooked by Meridian at the gate with an efficiency that had felt to him like injury added to insult. He did not yet know about the video. His wife Susan was quiet beside him in a way she had not been quiet in years, and he interpreted this as solidarity, which was the kind of mistake men like Richard Thompson make about the women beside them, right up until the moment those women decide they are done being quiet. Richard's phone buzzed with a news alert. He read the headline, read it again, then read it a third time. The way you read something when your brain is actively refusing to process what your eyes are showing it. He looked up from his phone. Susan was already looking at him. How bad? She said. He turned the phone toward her. She read it. Her expression did not crumple or collapse. It did something quieter and more final than that. It simply closed, the way a door closes. And Susan Thompson looked out the airplane window at the wide expanse of clouds below them, and did not speak again for the rest of the flight. Back in the air above them, Jasmine Wilson had fallen asleep against the window. She had not meant to. The adrenaline had dropped sometime after takeoff and taken her down with it. And now she was breathing slowly, her cheek against the window, her braids falling forward across her shoulder. Kayla sat beside her and did not sleep. Kayla sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about what her sister had said earlier. I'm not scared. And the precision with which she had said it, the total absence of performance in it, the way Jasmine had always been able to say true things directly, without dressing them up or down. Kayla was not like that. Kayla felt everything a beat behind Jasmine, turned it over more, held it longer. She had been angry on that plane, in a way Jasmine hadn't been. Jasmine's anger had gone cold and focused. Kayla's had gone deep and hot, and was still sitting in her chest like an ember. She thought about the way Richard Thompson had dropped those boarding passes on the floor. She thought about the ease of it. She took out the small notebook she carried everywhere, a habit she'd had since she was young, something her mother had started with her. And she wrote one line. She did not write a paragraph or a summary or her feelings, just one line, the way she always did when something happened that was too big to fit in ordinary language. She wrote, "Today, someone learned that we were real." She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window at the Georgia sky. blue and enormous and completely indifferent. And she thought about her grandma's lemon cake. And she let herself, for the first time since the morning started, feel something close to peace. The flight attendant, Jessica, came by with water and a small bag of pretzels, and she set them down on Kayla's tray without a word. And when Kayla looked up, Jessica gave her a nod that was more honest than anything she had said out loud. And Kayla took the water and said, "Thank you," and meant it. 3 rows behind them, the older black couple were holding hands. The man had his eyes closed. The woman was watching Jasmine sleep. And somewhere below, on the tarmac of an airport that was already beginning to receive its first satellite trucks, a story that had started with a wave of one man's hand was about to become something that no hand, no matter how powerful, no matter how certain, no matter how accustomed to being obeyed, was ever going to be able to stop. The plane touched down at the Atlanta airport, and Jasmine woke up the way she always woke from deep sleep, all at once, completely, like a switch being thrown. She straightened in her seat, looked at Kayla, and Kayla showed her the phone without a word. The number on the screen was over 1 million views. Jasmine stared at it. She had understood in an abstract way that the video existed. She had understood when her father texted, "Let it breathe." That something was already moving. But over 1 million was not abstract. Over 1 million was the kind of number that had weight, that had temperature, that meant the thing that happened in that first-class cabin had already traveled to places she would never be able to trace. "Comments," she said. Kayla handed her the phone. Jasmine scrolled for about 15 seconds and then handed it back. Not because it was bad. Most of it wasn't bad. Most of it was people who were furious on her behalf. Strangers who had never met her pouring real emotion into text boxes. But because reading about yourself in the third person while you are still in the same clothes you were wearing when the thing happened is a deeply strange experience. And Jasmine Wilson, for all her composure, was still 11 years old. And she needed a minute. "Dad land yet?" she asked. "His flight from New York gets in later," Kayla said. "Andre is picking us up now. Grandma knows we're coming." "Does Grandma know about—" "Yes." Jasmine closed her eyes briefly. Their grandmother, Evelyn Wilson, was a woman who had lived through things that made Richard Thompson look like a minor inconvenience in the long American catalog of major ones. Evelyn was waiting for those girls with lemon cake and open arms. And Jasmine could already hear in her head exactly what Evelyn was going to say when she saw them. She was going to hold Jasmine's face in both her hands, and she was going to say, "Your mother would be so proud." And Jasmine was going to have to hold herself together for that, which was going to take every bit of the same discipline she'd used in that cabin. She took a breath. She picked up her bag. She followed Kayla off the plane. By the time they reached the car, the story had a name, not one that anyone had chosen. It had generated itself the way stories do when they hit the internet with enough velocity. People were calling it the boarding pass video. And the 43 seconds of Thomas Ellis's footage had been sliced and reposted, and quoted, tweeted, and broken down frame by frame until every second of it existed in dozens of different contexts. The moment of the crumple, the drop, Jasmine's face, Kayla stepping forward, Richard Thompson's mouth forming. "Get out of my sight." That phrase, "get out of my sight," had become its own current. People were putting it on graphics. People were using it as a caption under photos of themselves in places they had been told, explicitly or otherwise, that they did not belong. A teenager in Chicago posted a photo of herself in her school's honors class with the caption, "Get out of my sight." A black doctor in Houston posted a photo from her hospital's boardroom. A grandmother in Mississippi posted a photo from her church's front pew, the one her family had been told for decades was not for them. None of this had reached Jasmine yet. She was in a car with Kayla and Andre moving through Atlanta traffic, looking out the window at a city that was going about its ordinary morning. And she was thinking about her mother. She thought about her mother more than she told people. That was the thing about grief at 11. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the middle of ordinary moments and sits down beside you like it owns the seat. She thought about her mother now, because her mother would have been on that plane. Her mother would have been the one seated in the aisle. And Richard Thompson would never have dared. Not because her mother was less herself than Kayla or Jasmine, but because there is something about a parent's presence that changes the arithmetic of a confrontation, that adds a variable powerful people calculate before they act. Without her mother, they had been alone, and they had handled it. And that was something, Jasmine thought. That was a real something. But it still sat beside the other thing, the quieter, older ache. And the two of them shared the back seat of her thoughts the whole drive to Evelyn's house. When Andre pulled up to Evelyn Wilson's home in a historic neighborhood in Atlanta, Evelyn was on the porch before the car stopped. She had seen them coming from the window, the way grandmothers always know. And she came down the porch steps with her arms already open and her face already doing what Jasmine had predicted it would do. She held Jasmine first, then Kayla, then Jasmine again, and she didn't say anything for a full minute, which was somehow more powerful than anything she could have said. Then she held Jasmine's face in both her hands, and Jasmine braced herself, and Evelyn said, "Your mother is sitting right here on this porch watching everything, and she is not surprised by one single thing you did." Jasmine held herself together. She did. But it was close. Inside Evelyn's house, the television was on, and the television was showing a news ticker that read, "Viral video sparks outrage. Billionaire's daughters removed from first-class seats." Evelyn turned the volume down when they came in, but didn't turn it off. And Jasmine noticed this and understood it. Evelyn was not the kind of woman who looked away from things. She was the kind of woman who turned the volume down so she could hear what the people in the room were saying, while keeping one eye on what the world was doing. "Sit," Evelyn said. "Eat first. Everything else can wait a little while." Kayla did not argue. Jasmine did not argue. They sat at Evelyn's kitchen table, which had a particular quality of solidity to it, the kind of table that had witnessed years of family history being made and processed and survived. And they ate scrambled eggs and toast and orange juice while Evelyn sat across from them and watched them eat with an expression that contained multitudes. In a conference room in Midtown Atlanta, a man named Bernard Hayes was on the phone with 3 people simultaneously. Bernard was David Wilson's lead attorney, and he was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers nervous, not because he was aggressive, but because he was patient. And patience in a lawyer is a quality that only activates when there is something serious enough to be patient about. He was currently being patient about several things at once. The first was Meridian Airlines' legal team, which had called to begin what they framed as a proactive dialogue regarding the morning's incident. Bernard had listened to their opening for a few minutes and then said, quietly, that David Wilson's position would be communicated through appropriate channels in due course, and had ended the call. The second was a civil rights organization whose director had reached out through David's communications office wanting to partner on a formal statement. Bernard had said he would pass the message along. The third and most interesting was a call from a journalist at a national newspaper who had obtained a copy of Richard Thompson's professional profile and who wanted David's team to confirm or deny certain details about Thompson's business dealings. Bernard confirmed nothing and denied nothing. He said, "Thank you," wrote down 3 things, and called David. David picked up on the first ring. "Thompson has a history," Bernard said. "What kind?" Employment discrimination complaint years ago, settled out of court. 2 former employees, both black women. His company is called Summit Capital, commercial real estate based in Chicago with U.S. operations. The journalist has the complaint documents. Silence on David's end. Then, did we find that or did they? They found it. We confirmed nothing. Good. A pause. Don't touch it. Let them run it on their own. Bernard nodded even though David couldn't see him. The airline's lawyers called. I know. Arthur Hayes called me directly first. Another pause. How's the video? Bernard looked at his screen. It was climbing fast. David absorbed this. The girls landed? They're at your mother's. Good. And here, beneath the strategy and the calculation, and the cold authority that David Wilson had deployed all morning like a chess player moving pieces, something human surfaced briefly in his voice, something that was just a father. They okay? Jasmine held it together on the plane from what I understand. Kayla, too. Of course they did, David said, and the pride in it was total and quiet and real. Then it was gone, and he was back. I need the airline's full incident report on my desk before I land. I need Jessica's employment record and Gary Mitchell's. And I need to know if the gate agent who told Thompson he was in those seats was negligent or complicit. Those are 2 different conversations. Understood, David. Bernard paused. The media cycle is moving fast. Amanda is going to need guidance soon. Tell Amanda to post one thing. Just one. A photo. Jasmine and Kayla at the gate before any of this happened. From our security camera footage, if we have it. No caption except their names. Nothing else. Bernard wrote it down. You sure? People are going to want a statement. The photo is the statement, David said. 2 little black girls. Their names. Let people fill in the rest. Amanda Lopez posted the photo. Within minutes, it had been shared tens of thousands of times. It was a simple image from the airport's security feed. Jasmine and Kayla Wilson standing at the gate in their matching travel outfits. Their bags on their shoulders, their boarding passes in Jasmine's hand. Their faces clear and unsuspecting and completely, heartbreakingly, ordinary. 2 little girls going to their grandmother's birthday party. That was all. That was everything. The caption read, Jasmine Wilson and Kayla Wilson. Nothing else. The internet did not need anything else. Richard Thompson, who had been sitting in a hotel room in a different city since his rebooked flight landed, found out about the photo the same way he'd found out about the video, through a news alert on his phone. He was on his 4th call with his attorney by this point, and he had moved through the stages of this particular crisis with the speed of a man who has never been in a crisis before, and therefore has no practiced equipment for it. He had gone from dismissive to defensive to indignant to something approaching actual fear in the span of a few hours, which was, by any measure, fast. His attorney, a man named Craig Bennett, who specialized in exactly this kind of reputational emergency, was trying to walk him through a containment strategy that required Richard to do 2 things he had never successfully done in his life. Stay quiet and wait. You cannot respond to the video, Craig said. Anything you say right now adds fuel. I'm being painted as a racist, Richard said. You are being painted as a racist because you crumpled 2 children's boarding passes and dropped them on the floor. Silence. Craig. Richard, I am telling you as your lawyer, as someone who has handled 100 of these, that the only move right now is silence. The moment you open your mouth, you become the story again. Right now, you're just in the story. There is a difference. Richard Thompson looked at his phone screen. The photo of Jasmine and Kayla at the gate was on his browser, and he had been looking at it for the last several minutes with an expression that his wife would have recognized and been troubled by if Susan had been in the room. But Susan was not in the room. Susan was in the bedroom with the door closed, and she had been there since they checked in, and she had not answered when he knocked an hour ago, which was a development that Richard Thompson had not yet fully processed. "My company is going to take a hit," he said. "Your company is going to take a significant hit," Craig confirmed. "The question is whether we manage that or whether we let it manage us. Right now, we wait. David Wilson is not waiting. David Wilson has 2 daughters who were treated badly on a plane. He has the moral high ground, the financial resources, and apparently the legal history of your settlement. Which, Richard, why didn't you tell me about that?" Another silence. Longer. "It was settled," Richard said. "It was settled, and it is now on the front page of websites," Craig said. "I need you to understand that this is no longer a story about airplane seats." Richard Thompson understood. He understood it the way you understand something when it is too late to do anything except understand it. In Evelyn Wilson's living room, Jasmine was asleep again on the couch. Genuinely and deeply asleep this time, with Evelyn's old quilt pulled over her and the television muted in the corner. Kayla was at the kitchen table with her notebook open, but she wasn't writing. She was watching her grandmother move around the kitchen. The deliberate, unhurried way Evelyn did everything, like she had decided long ago that rushing was a form of letting the world set your pace. And she was not interested in that arrangement. "Grandma," Kayla said. Evelyn looked up from the stove. "Were you ever treated like that? Like we were today?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She set down what she was holding. She turned to face Kayla fully, which was the thing Evelyn did when a question deserved her complete attention. "Baby," she said, "I was treated like that when there were laws that said it was legal." Kayla absorbed this. "Does it stop?" Kayla asked. "Ever?" Evelyn came to the table. She sat across from Kayla. She looked at her granddaughter for a long moment with eyes that had decades behind them. Joy and grief and fury and survival and love. And she said, "It changes. That's different from stopping. It changes when enough people decide they are done with it. What you and your sister did today." She paused. That was deciding. Kayla looked down at her notebook, at the lines she had written on the plane. "Today someone learned that we were real." She turned the notebook around and slid it across the table to Evelyn. Evelyn read it. She read it twice. Then she reached across and put her hand over Kayla's and held it. From the living room, Jasmine's phone buzzed on the coffee table. Both of them looked at it. Kayla went to check it and came back with her face carrying something new. Not alarm, not excitement exactly, but the particular expression of someone reading a number that has crossed a threshold into a different category of reality. "Millions," she said. Evelyn nodded slowly. "How many's that?" "Millions of people," Kayla said. Watching. Evelyn looked at the muted television, at the news ticker still running, at the photo of her granddaughters. She could see it on the screen standing at a gate with their boarding passes, their whole ordinary day ahead of them, not knowing yet what was coming. "Then they'll have to answer to millions of people," Evelyn said. And she said it with the calm certainty of someone who has been waiting her whole life for the world to get large enough to hold what she already knew was true. David Wilson's flight from New York landed later that day. Andre was at arrivals. David came through the doors carrying nothing but a phone and a jacket, moving with the particular economy of a man who has already thought through every step ahead of him. He got in the car and Andre handed him a tablet without being asked. David looked at it for the minutes it took to exit the airport, reading quickly, flipping through items. Bernard's report, Amanda's metrics, media requests, the journalist's article which had published with the headline, Summit Capital CEO has history of racial discrimination complaints amid viral airplane incident. He set the tablet down. He looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. "The girls," he said, "at Mrs. Wilson's. Jasmine slept most of the afternoon. Kayla's been writing." David smiled. Very briefly. Very privately. Then it was gone. "Meridian CEO called," Andre said. "Wants a personal conversation, not through lawyers. He can wait until Monday." And Jessica, the flight attendant, she filed an internal complaint against her own supervisor this morning. Apparently, Gary Mitchell told her before the flight that, and I'm quoting, "They're just kids. Handle it quick before more of the cabin wakes up." She wrote it down after the fact. HR has it. David turned to look at Andre. She filed it herself? Right after landing, David looked back at the window. Something moved across his face that was harder to name than anger or satisfaction. Something more like recognition. Like the world occasionally producing evidence of its own conscience. "Make sure her employment is protected," he said. "Whatever happens with Meridian's investigation, Jessica doesn't lose her job over this." Her supervisor? David said nothing for a moment. That's different. Jasmine Wilson woke up on her grandmother's couch for the second time that day. She lay still for a moment in the particular warmth of Evelyn's quilt, listening to the sounds of the house. Her grandmother's voice in the kitchen, Kayla's occasional quiet response, the muted television, the afternoon going on outside like nothing had happened. She thought about the boarding passes, about the crumple and the drop in the floor, about standing in that aisle. She thought about what her father had said. "You are not moving from that aisle." She hadn't. Neither had Kayla. And now millions of people were watching, and Richard Thompson was in a hotel room somewhere trying to contain what could not be contained, and the airline was in damage control. And Jessica had filed a complaint against her own supervisor. And the lemon cake was in Evelyn's kitchen, waiting. Jasmine sat up. She picked up her phone. She had texts she hadn't read, a missed call from her father, and a notification from a news app. She opened the notification. The headline stopped her cold. She read it 3 times. Then she stood up from the couch and walked to the kitchen doorway, and stood there until Kayla looked up from her notebook and saw Jasmine's face and said, "What?" Jasmine turned her phone around. Kayla read it. Her expression went through several things quickly. Then she looked up at her sister and said the only thing there was to say. "Dad already knew." Jasmine nodded slowly. "He let it happen on its own," Kayla said. "He didn't push it. It found its own way." Jasmine looked down at the headline one more time, at Richard Thompson's name, at the words settlement and racial discrimination, and Summit Capital and the 2 women. Not girls, women. Grown women with careers and names and lives who had been through something years before that nobody had paid attention to until now. Until 2 11-year-old girls stood in an aisle and refused to move. Jasmine put her phone in her pocket. "Grandma," she said, "is the cake for later or can we have some now?" Evelyn turned around from the stove with an expression that was lemon and love and years of knowing that sometimes the most radical thing you can do after a hard day is sit down, eat something sweet, and let tomorrow come. "Now," Evelyn said. "Absolutely now." The lemon cake was everything Evelyn had promised and more. And they ate it at the kitchen table with the television still muted in the other room and David Wilson sitting at the head of the table looking at his daughters like a man who had been reminded for the 100th time that day what everything he had ever built was actually for. He had arrived at Evelyn's house that afternoon, and the moment Jasmine saw him come through the door, she had walked directly into his arms without a word. And he had held her there for a long time, his chin on top of her head, his eyes closed. And Kayla had come around and put her arms around both of them, and the three of them had stood in Evelyn's hallway in a knot of quiet and relief, while Evelyn watched from the kitchen doorway and said absolutely nothing, which was the most generous thing she could have offered. They did not talk about what had happened on the plane during dinner. That was David's decision, and it was the right one, and everyone at the table understood it without being told. Evelyn talked about the neighborhood. Kayla asked about a cousin in Charlotte. David ate 2 slices of cake and looked younger than he had looked at the airport. Jasmine was quieter than usual. Not troubled, not closed off, just processing in the particular interior way that was distinctly hers. The way she had processed things since she was small, sitting with the full weight of something before she let it out. It was after dinner when Evelyn and Kayla were doing dishes, and David was sitting with Jasmine on the back porch in the evening that it finally came out. "Dad," Jasmine said. "Yeah." When he dropped the boarding passes on the floor. She stopped. David waited. "He looked at me while he did it," she said. "He didn't look away. He wanted me to see it." David was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, but presence. The kind that says, "I am here, and I am holding this with you." "I know," he said. "I wasn't going to cry," Jasmine said. "I want you to know, I wasn't going to cry." "I know that too." "I was angry," she said. "But it wasn't like regular angry. It was like I felt it before, that specific kind, where someone looks at you, and you can tell that you are not a full person to them. You're just a category." David turned to look at her. His daughter, 11 years old, sitting in the evening dark with the city sounds around them, articulating something that took most people decades to put into language. He thought about his own mother, feet away in the kitchen. He thought about what Evelyn had survived. He thought about the first time he had felt exactly what Jasmine was describing. He had been younger, and it had been a teacher, not a stranger on a plane. And it had been a smaller moment in some ways, and a larger one in others. And he had carried it inside him, and built something out of it that employed thousands of people and owned part of an airline. That feeling, David said carefully, is information. It tells you something real about the world. The question is what you do with it. "I stood there," Jasmine said. "You stood there," he confirmed. "Kayla stood there with me." "She did." Jasmine looked at her hands. "Is that enough? Just standing there?" David thought about this for a real moment, not a performed one. Today it was more than enough, he said. Standing there, being seen, not moving. Millions of people watch that. Do you understand what that means? People who have been in that position their whole lives. People who were told to move and did because they didn't know they had the right not to. They watched two little girls hold their ground and something happened for them. Something real. Jasmine was quiet. Then she said, "Kayla wrote something on the plane. She showed me. She wrote, today someone learned that we were real." David absorbed this. "That's your sister," he said softly. "Yeah," Jasmine said. In a hotel room in Charlotte, North Carolina, Richard Thompson had not slept. The ground had begun to disappear beneath his feet in slow motion, unable to stop it, unable to reverse it, only able to watch. Craig Bennett had called several times. 2 of those calls Richard had answered. The last one, Craig had said 3 words Richard Thompson would hear in his sleep for years, if he slept, which seemed unlikely. Summit Capital is trending. Not Richard Thompson is trending. Not the airplane video is trending. Summit Capital, his company, the thing he had built over years, the company that had employees and major institutional clients, and a deal in the pipeline that was supposed to close soon. Summit Capital was trending because a journalist had connected the video of him crumpling 2 children's boarding passes to a discrimination settlement that he had paid to make disappear quietly. It had not disappeared quietly. When Susan Thompson knocked on the hotel room door, Richard had not heard from her since she closed the bedroom door that afternoon, and he had assumed she was asleep. He opened the door and looked at his wife and immediately understood that she was not, and had not been, and that something had shifted in her in the hours since the plane that was not going to shift back. She had her phone in her hand. She held it up. On the screen was the journalist's article, the one with the settlement. Richard looked at it, and then looked at her face. "You knew," Susan said. "When those women filed, you knew what you'd done, and you paid to make it go away, and you never told me." Richard opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "Don't do whatever you were about to do. I've been in that bedroom reading for hours, and I'm done with whatever you were about to do." The silence between them had a specific texture. The texture of a marriage at a particular junction. The kind of junction that people sometimes back away from, and sometimes walk straight through. And which one it would be was entirely unclear to Richard Thompson in that moment, which was itself a new experience. Because Richard Thompson was a man accustomed to knowing what was going to happen. "Susan, I watched you drop those papers on the floor," she said. "I was sitting right there. I watched you do it to an 11-year-old girl, and I didn't say a word, and I have been sitting with that all day." Her voice was steady, which was somehow more disturbing than if it had broken. "I'm not going to be that person. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to be that person." She turned and went back to the bedroom. The door closed behind her. Not slammed. Closed. Precisely. Finally, with total control, Richard Thompson sat down on the edge of the hotel bed and put his face in his hands. In Atlanta, David Wilson's phone rang. It was Bernard. David stepped off the porch and took the call in the hallway. He listened without speaking. Then he said, "When?" Bernard said something. David said, "All 3?" Bernard said something else. David was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Don't respond tonight. Let me think." He ended the call and stood in Evelyn's hallway for a moment looking at nothing. His mind doing the thing it did when it was working, going very still on the outside and very fast on the inside. Jasmine appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had her father's ability to read a room without being told what was in it. "What happened?" she said. David looked at his daughter. He had a rule about this, about what he shared with his girls and what he held back, about the line between raising them to understand the world and burdening them with the adult weight of it before they needed to carry it. But Jasmine was looking at him with those steady, dark eyes, and she had already carried more that day than most adults carried in a year. And he decided she had earned the next sentence. "Meridian Airlines just suspended Jessica and Gary Mitchell pending investigation," he said. "Both of them." Jasmine's expression moved. "Jessica filed a complaint against Gary." I know, they suspended her anyway. Same action, different reasons. At least officially. He watched his daughter absorb this. Jessica is going to be okay. I've already told Bernard to make sure of that. But Gary Mitchell and 2 other people, including the gate agent who directed Thompson to your seats, are facing termination. Jasmine was quiet. Then the gate agent told him he was in those seats on purpose. Unclear. Could have been negligence. Could have been something worse. That's what the investigation is for. Jasmine looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked up. What about the 2 women from the settlement at Thompson's company? David looked at her. You read the article. While you were driving from the airport, Kayla showed me. Jasmine held his gaze. Are they okay? Do they know what's happening? David was quiet for a beat, and in that beat something passed across his face that he didn't usually let pass across his face in front of people. Something that was pride so deep it hurt. One of them gave an interview this afternoon, he said. She said she'd spent years wondering if she should have fought harder. She said, watching you stand in that aisle, answered the question. Jasmine pressed her lips together. She nodded once, very slightly, the way David nodded when something hit him hard, and he was keeping it internal. Okay, she said. She turned and went back to the kitchen. David stood in the hallway for another moment. Then he called Bernard back and said, on second thought, draft the statement. Have it ready by morning. We'll decide then. By evening, the video had millions of views, and Richard Thompson's name had been mentioned in the same sentence as the settlement on every major cable news network that was still broadcasting. The story had completed the cycle that stories complete when they carry enough moral weight and enough visual evidence. It had moved from social media outrage to legitimate news coverage, to the kind of sustained, slow-burning national conversation that doesn't peak and crash, but instead settles in and stays, becoming part of the ongoing record of what a country is willing to tolerate and what it finally decides it is not. One of Summit Capital's institutional clients, a real estate investment trust based in Boston, sent a brief formal email to Summit Capital's general contact address stating that they were reviewing their partnership agreements in light of recent developments and would be in touch. It was the most expensive email Richard Thompson would ever receive, and he wouldn't see it until the next morning. Susan Thompson in the bedroom was on the phone with her sister in Boston. Her sister said, "What are you going to do?" And Susan said, "I don't know yet." And her sister said, "Yes, you do." And Susan was quiet for a long time and then said, "Yes, I do." She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. In the historic neighborhood in Atlanta, Evelyn Wilson's house was quiet. Kayla was asleep in the guest room, properly asleep under proper covers with her notebook on the nightstand and the night cool outside the window. Evelyn had gone to bed. She intended to meet the next day rested, and David was still up sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his phone, and the particular stillness of a man who has been running at full capacity all day and is finally at the end of it, letting himself stop. Jasmine came downstairs. David looked up. "You should be asleep." "I know." She sat down across from him. She had her notebook. She'd borrowed one of Kayla's, the spare Kayla always carried, and she set it on the table. "Dad," she said, "I want to do something." "What kind of something?" "I want to write a letter to the 2 women from Thompson's company from the settlement." David looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. The house was quiet around them. Evelyn's clock on the wall ticking. The city outside going on in its nighttime way. "What do you want to say to them?" he said. Jasmine opened the notebook she had already started. She turned it so he could see the first lines written in her careful, precise handwriting. "I don't know if you'll ever see this. I'm 11 years old. I don't know everything that happened to you. But I know it was real and I know you were right. And I know that nobody stood up then the way they should have. David read it. He read it twice. He set the notebook down on the table and looked at his daughter and did not speak for several seconds, which for David Wilson, who was by profession and nature a man of rapid decisions and faster words, was the loudest thing he could have done. "Finish it," he said. "I'll make sure they get it." Jasmine nodded and pulled the notebook back and picked up her pen. David watched her write. The morning after, Evelyn Wilson's birthday arrived with the particular quality of mornings that follow difficult days. The quality of light that seems brighter than usual, not because anything has physically changed, but because exhaustion has a way of sharpening the edges of things. Jasmine woke early. Kayla woke right after, which she always attributed to Jasmine's wake-up somehow transmitting across the wall between their rooms. David was already on the phone in the kitchen, which surprised neither of them. By the time they sat down, the situation had moved again. Bernard's voice on the phone was careful and precise, which meant what it always meant when Bernard was careful and precise, that the news was significant and required delivery without distortion. "Meridian CEO Frank Davidson is calling a press conference soon," Bernard said. "He's issuing a full public apology. He's announcing the termination of Gary Mitchell and the gate agent, and he's announcing a formal review of first-class boarding protocols across all Meridian routes. He's also announcing a personal phone call to Jasmine and Kayla Wilson as part of his public statement." David was quiet. "He announced the call before making it?" "Yes." "He's managing optics?" "Yes." "But the substance is real. The terminations are real. The protocol review is real. He also, David, he's donating to a civil rights legal defense fund in Jasmine and Kayla's names." David stood up from the kitchen table. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment looking at Evelyn's backyard in the early morning light. "He's trying to get ahead of the lawsuit," David said. "Of course he is, but it doesn't make the donation less real." "No," David said. "It doesn't." He turned around. Jasmine was standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, and he held up one finger 1 minute. And she nodded and went to put the kettle on, because she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter started difficult mornings with something warm. "The statement," David said to Bernard. "Is it ready?" "Ready. Send it." David Wilson's official statement went out through his communications office, through Amanda, through every wire service that had been waiting. It was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described what happened on the plane, factually, without adjectives. The second paragraph named the systemic reality that what his daughters experienced was not an isolated incident, but an ordinary one. The kind that happened daily to black children and adults who were treated as trespassers in spaces they had every right to occupy. The third paragraph addressed Meridian directly and called for structural change, not symbolic gesture, with specific language about independent oversight of discrimination complaints. The fourth paragraph was the one that moved people. It read, "My daughters, Jasmine and Kayla, handled themselves with more dignity, more restraint, and more grace than the situation required. They did not do this because I trained them to perform dignity for the comfort of people who disrespect them. They did this because they know who they are. I want every child who watched that video, every child who has ever been waved away, dismissed, told to move along, treated as a category instead of a person, to know what my daughters know. You are exactly where you belong. Stand there. Do not move." The statement had hundreds of thousands of shares quickly. Thomas Ellis, the man from the row across, the man with the phone, posted his own statement on the platform where he'd originally uploaded the video. He was an electrical engineer from Memphis, Tennessee. and he wrote with the plain directness of a man who was not accustomed to public statements, but understood that this moment required one. He wrote that he had almost put his phone away. He wrote that he had almost told himself it wasn't his place. He wrote that Jasmine's face, the stillness of it, the absolute refusal to be diminished, had made him understand that looking away was its own kind of choice, and he had decided not to make it. He ended with, "I've been on 100 flights. I've looked away 100 times. Not anymore." That statement got hundreds of thousands of shares before the press conference. In Evelyn's kitchen, the birthday cake, a fresh lemon one because Evelyn had eaten the first one the night before and declared that a birthday deserved its own, was on the counter, and Evelyn was in her housecoat at the kitchen table reading David's statement on Kayla's phone, with her reading glasses on and her coffee in hand. She read it twice. She looked up at David, who was refilling his coffee at the counter. "Stand there," she said. "Do not move." She took off her glasses and set them on the table. "Your father would have said something like that." David looked at his mother. "Yeah?" He never wasted words, either. Jasmine came in from the hallway with her hair still in her sleep braids and her notebook in her hand. She set the notebook on the table in front of David. "I finished it," she said. "The letter." David picked it up. He read it. He read it the way he read things that mattered. Slowly, completely, not skimming, giving it the full weight of his attention. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Jasmine. "It's good," he said. "Will they really get it?" "I'm going to make sure of it today." Jasmine nodded. She pulled the notebook back toward herself and looked at what she'd written, and then said, "Kayla's still asleep. Let her sleep. She earned it. The airline CEO is calling soon?" "Frank Davidson." "Yes. Do you want me and Kayla on the call?" David considered this. "Do you want to be on it?" Jasmine thought about it for a real moment. "Yes," she said, "but I want to know what he's going to say before he says it. I don't want to be surprised again." David looked at his 11-year-old daughter, her sleep braids, her notebook, her absolute seriousness, and he thought not for the first or last time that she was going to do things in her life that he could not yet imagine the shape of, and that the world had better be paying attention. "I'll get Bernard to send us the talking points," he said. "Good." Jasmine took her notebook and went back upstairs to wake her sister. At the press conference, Frank Davidson looked tired in the way of a man who understood that looking tired was the appropriate public presentation for this particular morning. He apologized. He announced the terminations. He announced the protocol review. He announced the donation. He said Jasmine and Kayla Wilson's names clearly and correctly, and with a degree of genuine feeling that the people watching were broadly divided on. Some believed it and some didn't, and that division said more about the people watching than about Frank Davidson, who was a complicated person in a complicated position doing the best he could with the corner he had painted himself into. Seconds after the press conference ended, Craig Bennett called Richard Thompson and said, "The airline has fully separated from you. You're on your own." Richard Thompson, who had not slept, who had not eaten, who had spent the last day watching his professional reputation dismantle itself in real time, sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "What does that mean practically?" Craig said, "It means they will not be defending your actions. Their legal strategy going forward does not include you as an ally. If a lawsuit comes, and one is coming, Richard, I want to be direct with you. Meridian's defense will likely involve distancing themselves from your conduct as forcefully as possible." Richard said nothing. "There's more," Craig said. "Of course there is. The Boston firm, the REIT, they sent a termination notice this morning. They're pulling out of the partnership agreement. The deal you had in the pipeline is dead. The number was tens of millions. Richard Thompson did not say it out loud because saying it out loud would make it exist in a different way than it existed now, which was as an abstraction his mind was still refusing to fully process. "Richard," Craig said, "I need you to give me something to work with, some kind of human response we can put in front of the public, a statement, an apology. You told me not to respond. That was yesterday. Today, the airline has apologized, donated, fired people, and held a press conference. You are the only person in this story who has said nothing. That silence is now deafening." Richard Thompson looked at the hotel room wall. He thought about Susan in the bedroom. He thought about the look on Jasmine Wilson's face when he dropped those boarding passes. Not the before, when she'd been standing there asking for what was hers, but the during, the actual moment of the drop, when she had watched his hand open and the papers fall, and her expression had not crumpled or flinched, but had instead done something more unsettling than either. It had recorded, like a camera, like a document, like something that was going to exist long after the moment passed. He had known in that precise second that he had made an error. Not a moral error. He had not been thinking in moral terms, but a tactical one. He had looked into those eyes and understood that this child was not afraid of him. And that had made him angrier. And the anger had made him drop the papers. And now here he was. "Draft something," he said to Craig. "Send it to me. I'll look at it. Richard, for the apology to mean anything, it needs to come from you in your own words, not mine." A long pause. "I'll try," Richard said. He sat in the hotel room in the quiet of the morning with his marriage one door away, and his company millions lighter and his name attached to millions of views of the worst seconds of his adult life. And he opened the notes application on his phone, and he stared at the blank white screen for a very long time. He typed one sentence. Then he deleted it. Then he typed it again. Then he sat with it. The sentence was, "I was wrong." 3 words. He had built an entire identity on never needing them. Kayla Wilson came downstairs to find her father on the phone, her grandmother in the kitchen humming to herself over her birthday cake, and Jasmine sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook and a cup of tea writing something in her careful, deliberate hand, with the focused calm of someone who had already decided what the day was gonna be. Kayla sat beside her. Jasmine slid the notebook over so Kayla could read. It was the letter, the one for the women from the settlement. Kayla read it slowly, all the way to the end. Then she picked up the pen that Jasmine had set down, and without asking, without needing to ask, she signed her name beneath her sister's at the bottom. Jasmine looked at it, both their names together. She nodded. "That's better," Jasmine said. "Everything is better with both of us," Kayla said. And Evelyn, who had heard this from the kitchen, laughed, a full, warm laugh that filled the whole house, and said, "Now that is the truth. Come eat. Your father can do business after cake." David appeared in the doorway seconds later with his phone still in his hand and his jacket still on. And Evelyn pointed at the table with the same finger she had used to point at that table for decades. And David Wilson, CEO of Wilson Technologies, major shareholder of Meridian Airlines, the most feared man in the area, sat down and folded his hands and waited for his piece of birthday cake like everyone else. It was the morning of the birthday, and whatever was coming next, the lawsuit, the reckoning, the public conversation that was only just beginning to find its full voice, could wait a little while for lemon cake in the company of people who loved each other, in the particular, fierce and irreplaceable way that families love each other when they have been through something real. The cake plates were still on the table when David Wilson's phone rang, and everyone at the table knew from the way he looked at the screen that this was not a call he could let go to voicemail. He pushed back his chair, said, "1 minute," to no one in particular, and stepped into Evelyn's hallway with the phone already at his ear. Jasmine listened without trying to look like she was listening, which was a skill she had been practicing her whole life. She could hear her father's voice, not the words, but the register. And the register was the formal one, the one that sat slightly lower in his chest than his regular voice, the one that meant whoever was on the other end of the call was someone David needed to manage rather than simply talk to. Kayla was finishing her cake. Evelyn was watching David through the doorway with the patient expression of a woman who had spent decades watching men take calls at inconvenient times. David came back in minutes. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He took one bite of cake with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided that whatever is happening can wait until he finishes what is in front of him. And this small act, this single bite, told Jasmine everything about how serious the call had been. Her father only performed calm when the situation was actively requiring the opposite. Who was it? Evelyn asked. Because Evelyn asked. Senator Denise Grant's office, David said. She wants a meeting this week. The table was quiet for a moment. Senator Denise Grant was not a name that required context in this household. She was the senior senator from Georgia, one of the most powerful black women in the federal government, and she had been in office for years, building a legislative record that Evelyn Wilson had followed with the close attention of someone who understood that what happened in Washington was not abstract, but personal. Always personal. Always landing eventually on the kitchen table of somebody's house, in somebody's neighborhood. What does she want? Kayla asked. She's drafting legislation, David said. Passenger protection, anti-discrimination enforcement on domestic carriers. She's been trying to get co-sponsors for years. She thinks, he paused, glanced at his daughters. She thinks your names attached to this conversation might move some people who haven't moved yet. Jasmine set down her fork. She wants us to testify? Not testify, not formally, not yet. She wants to meet, talk through what happened, let her team understand the full picture. Jasmine and Kayla looked at each other across the table. That look, the twin look, the wordless, complete communication that had been their private language since before they could speak out loud, lasted a couple of seconds. Then Jasmine looked at her father. When? She said. David almost smiled. Almost. I told her office I'd call back after we finished birthday cake. Evelyn raised her coffee cup. Good man, she said. Hundreds of miles away in a Charlotte hotel room that was beginning to feel like a holding cell, Richard Thompson had been staring at 3 words on his phone screen for some time. I was wrong. The apology Craig had drafted and sent him was sitting in his email unopened because Richard had understood that opening it and reading it would be the moment he accepted that someone else was going to have to tell him how to be sorry. And he was not ready for that yet. And he was not sure he was ever going to be ready for it. And that uncertainty, that gap between knowing you needed to do something and being able to make yourself do it, was the most honest thing Richard Thompson had experienced in years. His phone buzzed. Not Craig, not Susan. A name he hadn't seen in years. His brother in Seattle, who had heard from their mother, who had seen the news. Richard stared at his brother's name on the screen. He let it ring. He let it ring because his brother Philip had spent years trying to have a specific conversation with Richard about a specific quality in Richard's character that Richard had spent years refusing to have. And the fact that Philip was calling now meant that quality had finally produced consequences large enough that even Richard could not reframe them. And Richard was not ready to hear Philip say, "I told you so," even gently, even with love, which was the only way Philip ever said anything. The call went to voicemail. Richard put the phone face down on the bed. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Susan, who had come out of the bedroom that morning, dressed, packed, and composed, and had told him she was going to her sister's in Boston, and that she needed time to think, and had left before he could formulate a response. She had not slammed the door. She had not cried. She had kissed him on the cheek very briefly, the way you kiss someone when you're not sure what kind of kiss is appropriate, and you were trying to be decent in the middle of something indecent. And then she was gone. Richard picked his phone back up. He opened the email from Craig. He read the draft apology. It was good. It was professional and contrite, and carefully worded to acknowledge wrongdoing without creating additional legal exposure, which was the tightrope that crisis apologies always had to walk. It was the kind of apology that Craig was very good at writing, and that Richard, reading it now, understood would never actually be good enough, not because of the legal precision. That was fine, but because it sounded exactly like what it was. A man performing regret under pressure. It did not sound like a man who understood in his body what he had actually done. He deleted it. He opened the Notes app. He looked at his 3 words. "I was wrong." He typed, "To Jasmine and Kayla Wilson." He stopped. He started again. He deleted it again. He put the phone down. He picked it up. He typed without stopping, the way people write when they stop managing the writing and just let it come out, which is the only way anything true ever gets written. When he finished, he had several sentences. They were not elegant. They were not legally optimized. They were the sentences of a man who had finally stopped arguing with himself and just said the thing plainly, the way it needed to be said. He sent it to Craig before he could read it again and talk himself out of it. Craig called him back quickly. "Richard, this is real. This is the right thing. Just send it," Richard said. "You understand once this is public." "Send it," Richard said. He put the phone down. He looked at the ceiling again. He felt something he could not immediately name. Not relief exactly. Not peace exactly. Something smaller and more provisional than either. Like the first breath after holding your breath for a very long time. Like the beginning of something that might eventually become a smaller version of okay. The apology, posted on Richard Thompson's professional social media account, which had previously existed primarily to announce commercial real estate deals and industry conference appearances, and had never said anything that anyone outside of his professional circle had any reason to care about. Within minutes, it had been screenshotted and shared tens of thousands of times. The internet's reaction was, as it always is, divided. Some people said it was too late, too convenient, too clearly pressure-driven to mean anything. Some people said it was the first honest thing he'd done since the whole situation started. Some people focused on specific sentences. The one where he said he had looked at 2 children and seen a category instead of people, and that this was not something he could blame on a bad morning or a moment of stress, but something that he had to look at honestly in himself. That sentence got quoted more than any other. That sentence, for some people, was the thing that made the difference between a PR performance and a human admission. Jasmine and Kayla did not read it right away. They were upstairs helping Evelyn get ready for the small birthday gathering that was happening that afternoon. Family, friends, neighbors, a few cousins, and Evelyn had opinions about which earrings, and Kayla had opinions about Evelyn's opinions. and Jasmine was mediating with the patient diplomacy of someone who understood that some negotiations required more delicacy than others, and that earring negotiations with a woman who had worn her own jewelry for half a century were among the more delicate kind. It was Kayla who saw the notification first. Sitting on the edge of Evelyn's bed, while Evelyn and Jasmine debated in the bathroom, she read the apology quietly. She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment, turning it over in her mind the way she turned everything over, taking it apart and looking at its pieces, and deciding what she thought of them independently before reassembling her judgment. "Jasmine!" she called. Jasmine appeared in the doorway. Kayla handed her the phone. Jasmine read it standing up, which was how she read things when she was not sure what her body was going to do with the information. She read it once, fast. Then she sat down on the bed next to Kayla and read it again, slowly. When she finished, she handed the phone back and was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said. "Yeah," Kayla said. "What do you think?" Kayla thought about it carefully. "I think he means it," she said. "The part about seeing a category instead of a person, I think he actually means that." "That doesn't fix it," Jasmine said. "No," Kayla said, "but it's true, and true matters." Jasmine looked at her sister. "You're more generous than me." "I'm not more generous," Kayla said. I want it to be real because if it's real, it means people can actually change. And if people can actually change, then everything that happened meant something more than just consequences." Jasmine absorbed this. She looked at her hands. She thought about what her father had said on the porch, the feeling of being seen as a category instead of a person, and how that feeling was information. She thought about what Kayla had written on the plane. Today, someone learned that we were real. She thought about the woman from Thompson's company who had spent years questioning herself and then watched the video and stopped. "Okay," Jasmine said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, it matters," Jasmine said, "whether it's real. It matters." She stood up. "Evelyn, what about the gold hoops?" she called through the bathroom door. Evelyn appeared immediately. "I said the pearls. The pearls are for funerals. It's your birthday. Gold hoops." Evelyn looked at Kayla for arbitration. Kayla raised both hands. "Gold hoops, Grandma." Final answer. Evelyn went back to the bathroom muttering something about children and what they knew about pearls. But when she came out later, she was wearing the gold hoops, and she looked magnificent, which everyone noted and only Kayla said out loud. David got the news from Bernard, and for the first time in hours, Bernard's voice carried something other than careful precision. It carried something that was almost excitement, controlled and professional, but alive underneath. Meridian Airlines board had convened an emergency session that morning. The result of that session, which Bernard had just confirmed through 2 independent sources, was the following. Frank Davidson had not merely apologized and donated. The board had voted unanimously to establish a permanent independent oversight committee for passenger discrimination complaints. The specific structural change that David had called for in his public statement, the one that went beyond symbolic gesture into actual accountability architecture. Furthermore, the committee's founding charter would include language drawn directly from David Wilson's statement, the phrase your daughters used as the operating principle. "You are exactly where you belong." It would appear in the founding document of the Oversight Committee as the standard against which all future discrimination complaints would be measured. David stood in Evelyn's kitchen and held the phone and said nothing for a long moment. "David," Bernard said. "Read that last part to me again," David said. Bernard read it again. David put his free hand flat on Evelyn's kitchen table, that old, solid, history-bearing table. And he stood there with both points of contact, the phone at his ear and his palm on the wood. and he thought about his daughters upstairs arguing about earrings with their grandmother on her birthday, and he thought about a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta and a second-hand laptop, and a vision that had seemed to many people who heard it in those early years like the particular kind of ambition that only survives in people who don't know any better. He had known better. He had known exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would cost, and exactly why it was worth it. And he had raised 2 daughters to know those same things about themselves. And that day at the gate, those daughters had demonstrated to millions of people and counting that he had not been wrong. "Tell the board thank you," he said, "through appropriate channels." "And Senator Grant," Bernard said, "set the meeting for this week." The birthday party that afternoon was small and warm, and full of the specific joy of people who love each other, and don't see each other often enough, and are making up for it in the space of a few hours. The cousins brought a peach cobbler. The neighbors brought flowers. Evelyn's oldest friend, a woman named Ruth, who had known Evelyn for decades and had opinions about everything, and was right about most of them, arrived a little late, took one look at Jasmine and Kayla and said, "There they are. I watched that video several times." She held Jasmine's face in her hands, which was apparently a family gesture, and said, "Don't you ever let anybody wave you away, you hear me? Not ever." And Jasmine said, "Yes, ma'am," with complete sincerity. And Ruth said, "Good," and went to find the cobbler. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons move, too fast, with the quality of something you want to hold on to even while it's happening. Jasmine sat on the porch with Ruth and 2 cousins and listened to stories about Evelyn that she had never heard before. Stories from decades she hadn't been alive for. Stories that connected the woman she knew to a younger woman she could only imagine. And those connections felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The way roots feel important even when you can't see them. Kayla spent most of the afternoon close to David, not in a clingy way, not in any way that looked like anything from the outside, but in the way of a daughter who had processed something significant and needed to be in proximity to the person who anchored her sense of the world. David noticed and did not comment. He just made sure for the rest of the afternoon that he was wherever Kayla was. With the party winding down and the cousins saying their goodbyes, Jasmine's phone rang. She looked at the screen and went still. The number was not saved in her contacts, but below it the carrier had helpfully identified it. Washington, D.C. She looked at her father. David looked at the screen. His expression gave nothing away, which meant he already knew what this was. "You want to take it?" he said. "Who is it?" "Take it and find out," he said. Jasmine looked at the screen for one more second. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was warm and direct, and carried the particular cadence of a woman who had spent years learning how to make people feel both respected and at ease in the first seconds of a conversation. "Jasmine, this is Senator Denise Grant. I hope I'm not interrupting your grandmother's birthday." Jasmine straightened. "No, ma'am. We're just wrapping up." "Good. I'll be brief. Your father and I are meeting this week, but I wanted to call you myself. Not your father, not through an office. You. Because what you did was not your father's action. It was yours." A pause. "How are you doing? Honestly." Jasmine had been asked this question many times in the last day, and she had answered it many times with the carefully calibrated honesty of someone managing a public moment. She thought about doing that now. She considered the phrasing, the framing, the version of the answer that was true, but also controlled. Then she thought about what Kayla had written on the plane. "I'm processing," she said. "I'm okay, but I think I'll understand how okay later." Does that make sense?" Senator Grant was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "That is the most honest answer I've heard from anyone in this situation. And I've been in politics for years. Yes, that makes perfect sense." Another pause. "I want you to know something, Jasmine. I've been trying to move this legislation for years, and I couldn't get the traction I needed. Because people could say it was theoretical. It was abstract. It was activists overstating the problem. You and your sister made it impossible to call it abstract. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I think so," Jasmine said. "You changed the conversation," Grant said. "Not your father, even though he's formidable and we both know it. You, a child who stood in an aisle and did not move. That is the specific thing that moved what I could not move, and I need you to understand that, because I need you to understand the kind of power you carry." Jasmine looked at her hand, the hand that had been shaking after it was over, that Kayla had pointed out and she had pressed flat against her knee. It was steady now. "What do you need from us?" Jasmine said. "This week," Grant said, "I want to hear your story in your own words. I want my staff to hear it. And then I want to tell you what we're building and see what you think." She paused. "You are 11 years old, and I'm older. And I'm asking what you think because your perspective is worth having. Is that all right with you?" "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine said. "That's all right." When the call ended, she sat on Evelyn's porch for a moment in the late afternoon. The party noises fading behind the screen door. The cousin's car pulling out of the driveway. The day coming down toward evening. Kayla came out and sat beside her without asking what the call was, because she had seen Jasmine's face through the window and understood that this was a sit-in-silence moment, not a speak moment. They sat. After a while, Jasmine said, "Senator Grant." "I know," Kayla said. "I heard Dad tell Evelyn. She said we changed the conversation." Kayla let this settle between them. Then she said, "Do you believe her?" Jasmine thought about it. She thought about Thomas Ellis, who had almost looked away. She thought about the older black couple holding hands. She thought about the woman from the settlement who had spent years questioning herself and then watched the video and stopped. She thought about all the people who had put themselves in that photo of them at the gate. Their names, nothing else. And had filled in the captions themselves with their own stories, their own aisle moments, their own versions of being waved away. "Yes," she said, "I do." The weeks that followed moved with the particular speed of things that have been set in motion and cannot be stopped, only shaped. Bernard filed the initial legal action against Meridian Airlines days after the flight. The class action component was added when dozens of other passengers, people who had experienced discrimination on Meridian flights over the previous years and had been waiting for a moment large enough to attach their stories to, came forward through the legal office that Bernard had established specifically to receive them. Their names and their stories were different, but they shared a common structure, a wave of a hand, an assumption, a small and practiced diminishment carried out in the ordinary course of travel. Gary Mitchell was terminated. The gate agent was terminated the same day. Her termination was the more complicated one. The investigation had found that her decision to direct the Thompsons to those seats had not been random error, but the result of a pattern, a quiet, habitual assumption about who belonged where, on the aircraft, that she had never once had to examine, because no one had ever asked her to. She was young. She did not know she was doing it. That did not make it better, but it made it a different kind of problem than deliberate malice, and the distinction mattered. And David Wilson made sure Bernard noted it in the formal record. Jessica kept her job. She had filed her internal complaint against Gary Mitchell within an hour of landing. at a moment when the easy thing would have been to say nothing and see what settled. She had not done the easy thing. Her employment was protected by specific language in the settlement agreement that Bernard negotiated with Meridian's legal team, language that David had insisted on and that Frank Davidson, to his credit, had not fought. Jessica called the Wilson family's communications office to say thank you on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. She did not speak to David. She did not ask to. She left a message with Amanda that said, "Please tell the girls I'm sorry it took me a minute, but I got there." Amanda read the message to Jasmine over the phone. Jasmine said, "Tell her we know, and thank you." Richard Thompson's apology, the several sentences, the unelegant, honest ones, was received differently by different people, as all apologies are. The two women from the settlement whose names were Diane Okafor and Sandra Mensah both read it. Diane had given the interview the day of the flight. Sandra had said nothing publicly until later, when she posted a single paragraph on her own social media account, saying that she had read the apology and that she believed some part of it was real, and that she was choosing to believe that part, not for Richard Thompson's sake, but for her own. She said that carrying the weight of someone else's unexamined tragedy and cruelty was the most expensive thing she had ever done, and she was tired of paying for it. Sandra Mensah's paragraph got shared hundreds of thousands of times. Summit Capital did not survive the quarter. The Boston REIT's withdrawal had triggered a contractual cascade that Richard's lawyers tried and failed to stop. The company's restructuring filing came soon after. Richard Thompson, who had spent years building Summit Capital, sat in a conference room in Chicago and signed the papers with the signature of a man who understood that this was the consequence of something he had done, and not the consequence of something that had been done to him, and that the difference between those two things was the whole of what he needed to spend the rest of his life working out. Susan Thompson filed for separation soon after. She called it a separation and not a divorce because she told her sister she was not ready to be certain about anything permanent. And her sister said that was fair, and Susan moved into an apartment in Boston and started, for the first time in a long time, talking to people about things she had not talked about before. This process was uncomfortable and slow, and she described it to her therapist as feeling like being turned inside out, which her therapist said was accurate, and that inside out was often the direction healing traveled. Susan thought about this a lot. She thought about the afternoon in the hotel bedroom when she had sat with hours of reading and arrived at a version of herself she could actually look at. She thought about the girls in the aisle, two 11-year-old girls in matching travel outfits with their boarding passes in hand. And she thought that if she was ever going to be a person worth being, she owed them something that was not about them at all, but about her, which was the decision to stop sitting in the seat beside the thing and calling it neutrality. David Wilson and Jasmine and Kayla Wilson met with Senator Denise Grant in Washington, D.C. They arrived in the morning. The meeting lasted hours longer than originally scheduled and ran over because Jasmine had questions, precise, structured, quietly relentless questions about the legislation, about the oversight mechanism, about what enforcement actually looked like on the ground when the cameras were not rolling, and the moment was not viral. And Senator Grant answered every one of them with the seriousness they deserved, and at one point turned to her chief of staff and said, simply, "She should be in the room when we draft this." And her chief of staff nodded and wrote something down. And Jasmine heard this and kept her face even, and her voice level, and stored it in the place where she kept things that mattered. Kayla sat beside her the whole meeting and asked 3 questions, each one landing at exactly the moment a question was needed, each one opening a door in the conversation that the room had been about to walk past. Senator Grant told Kayla after the meeting that she had the instincts of a strategist, and Kayla said, "My sister does the strategy. I do the listening." And Grant said, "In my experience, the listener is half the strategy." And Kayla filed that away in her notebook that evening, word for word. The legislation, the Passenger Protection and Anti-Discrimination Enforcement Act, was introduced early the following year with co-sponsors, several of whom had previously declined to sign on and had changed their positions in the months since the flight. Senator Grant named the founding principle in her floor statement. She quoted David Wilson's statement directly. "You are exactly where you belong. Stand there. Do not move." The chamber wasn't full because they rarely are for a morning floor statement, but the people who were there were paying attention, and the ones who were paying attention understood that this was one of those moments where the ordinary business of legislation briefly aligns with something larger than itself, with the accumulated weight of all the ordinary moments that had made it necessary. Jasmine Wilson watched the floor statement on her laptop at Evelyn's kitchen table during winter break with Kayla beside her, and Evelyn behind them with her coffee and her reading glasses and her decades of context for exactly this moment. When it was over, Evelyn said, "Your grandfather marched for decades and never saw this get this far, this fast." She said it without bitterness and without excessive pride. The way facts are stated when you have lived long enough to understand that facts are complicated and partial and real all at once. Jasmine looked at the screen for a moment. Then she opened her notebook to a blank page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote one line. Kayla leaned over to read it. The line said, "We are not done yet." Kayla read it. She nodded once. She picked up her own pen and on her own notebook page wrote the same date and then wrote below it her line from the plane. "Today, someone learned that we were real." And then beneath that, she added one new line. "And tomorrow they will not forget it." Outside Evelyn's window, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta always does. Pressing forward, moving through, carrying its history and its future in the same arms the way cities that have survived things always do. Somewhere in that city, people were getting on planes. People were sitting in seats they had paid for, seats they deserved, seats that were simply and completely and without qualification theirs. And somewhere in the long, imperfect, still unfinished project of building a country that actually meant what it said, 2 11-year-old girls had added one small, indelible, recorded moment to the record. The moment of standing still in an aisle, of not moving, of looking back at the man who expected you to flinch and showing him clearly and permanently that you were not going to. That moment was 43 seconds long. It was millions of views. It was co-sponsors on a piece of legislation. It was Sandra Mensah choosing to put down a weight she had been carrying for years. It was Thomas Ellis who had almost looked away and didn't. It was Jessica who had gotten there a minute late, but had gotten there. It was Evelyn Wilson drinking her coffee, watching her granddaughters write in their notebooks, understanding without needing it, explained that what she was looking at was not the end of something, but the beginning of the next thing. The same thing continued, carried forward by different hands, into a future that owed its shape in part to an ordinary morning when 2 little girls stood in an aisle and refused, absolutely and without apology, to move. Jasmine Wilson closed her notebook. She was 11 years old and she had already changed something real about the world, and she knew it. And she was not finished. And she knew that too. Some people are born for ordinary lives and choose extraordinary ones. Some people have the extraordinary thrust upon them in the space of 43 seconds in a first-class cabin on a morning. Jasmine and Kayla Wilson were both kinds of person at once, chosen and choosing, acted upon and acting, standing still and moving forward in the same breath. They had not asked for the wave of Richard Thompson's hand. They had not asked to be the one standing in that aisle at that moment with those boarding passes, and that particular, precise, absolute refusal to be less than what they were. But they had been there, and they had held their ground, and the world, in all its slowness and difficulty and occasional hard-won grace, had shifted. Just slightly, just measurably, just enough, because they did. In the quiet hum of an ordinary morning flight, two 11-year-old girls stood their ground in an airplane aisle and reminded the world of a truth we too often forget. Your worth is not up for negotiation. When Richard Thompson waved Jasmine and Kayla away like they were nothing, he didn't just dismiss two children. He exposed the quiet poison of assumptions that tell certain people they don't belong in the spaces they've earned. Yet what happened next wasn't about revenge or rage. It was about dignity, meeting power and refusing to blink. Those two sisters, with steady voices and unshaken hearts, showed us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand still, speak truth, and refuse to move from the place that is rightfully yours. This story isn't really about seats on a plane. It's about every time someone has been told, by a look, a word, or a casual wave of the hand, that they are less than, smaller than, or out of place. It's about the children who watch us and learn whether they should shrink or rise. Jasmine and Kayla didn't rise because they were loud or angry. They rose because their father had spent years teaching them they were real, whole, and worthy exactly where they stood. And in doing so, they gave millions of people watching a gift, the courage to believe the same thing about themselves. Life will test you. Someone will try to shrink your space, dim your light, or make you feel like an intruder in your own story. When that moment comes, remember those two girls in the aisle. Stand tall. Speak clearly. Do not move. Your presence is not a favor. It is your birthright. If this story stirred something deep inside you, if it made your chest tighten with recognition, or your eyes sting with pride, drop a comment below and tell me, what's one moment when you chose to stand your ground? Which city are you watching from today? And if you believe we need more stories like this, ones that remind us who we really are, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join this family. Let's keep lifting each other up, one honest story at a time. See you in the next one.